So happy Palm Sunday, everybody. Before we get into the text, just want to reiterate what Pastor Chris shared. I was kind of blown away last week when I was in one of the staff meetings, and they shared the simple fact that in order to pull off the 7 services that we're going to have at the end of the week, between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, including Easter Eve, we need a total of approximately 600 volunteers. And then I was talking with Tim in the back there. Tim's been with us since the very beginning. He said, I think that's more than we had at our first Easter service. I'm like, yeah, it's a lot more than we had at our first Easter service, right? $600. So first off, I want to say thank you to those of you who have stepped up and stepped into that space and you're helping fill that void. But for those of you that might be on the edge a little bit, am I really needed? The answer is overwhelmingly yes, we need you. So like Pastor Chris said, if God is tugging on your heart to help us out during those services, lots of different volunteer opportunities. We expect several thousand people to come through our doors during that 3-day time period, so you can stop by and talk to the people right on the other side of this wall. So it is the beginning of Holy Week. I'm gonna bring a slightly different Palm Sunday message. Typically, we spend our time focusing on the text that has Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. People are waving palm branches in front of him. He's declaring himself the king. And we're gonna spend some time in that text, but I thought I'd do something a little different. Not only are we gonna cover Sunday, but we're gonna walk through the events of Jesus' life on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Why is that? Well, it might surprise you to know that most of the gospel authors spend about 1/3 of their time focused on the last week of Jesus' life. If he was on the planet for 33 years, focusing on the last 7 or 8 days tells you that there's something there. In fact, in John's gospel, he spends about 50% of his writing focusing on this time period. Why is that? Well, if you understand what Jesus did between Palm Sunday and Resurrection Sunday, then you actually understand the very heartbeat of Christianity itself. You understand who Jesus is and why he came to this planet. The most fundamental, the most important question that a human being can ask is this: what do I believe about Jesus? So as the authors focus on this 8-day period, we're gonna focus on the 4 or 5 days leading up to Good Friday. Here's where we're gonna start, Matthew chapter 21, also known as the Triumphal Entry, Palm Sunday. It says this: now when they, that is Jesus and his disciples, drew near to Jerusalem, they came to Bethphage, a small town, to the Mount of Olives. So Jesus and his disciples were in Bethany. This is the same place where Jesus, just a short while earlier, he raised his good friend Lazarus from the dead. So they're on their way from Bethany to Jerusalem. It's Passover week, so the city of Jerusalem itself would swell in population. The ancient historian Josephus tells us that there may have been as many as 2 million people ascending on the city. Some think that he's over-exaggerating, but even by conservative estimates, the town would have been 50, 60,000 in Jerusalem at this time. It would at least go to 250 to 300,000. It would be hard to find a place to stay in Jerusalem, so it appears, as we read the text, you'll see that Jesus was in the area of Bethany, just a short couple miles outside of Jerusalem itself. So they're making their way into town. Then Jesus sent 2 disciples, verse 2, saying to them, go into the village in front of you, again, the village of Bethphage, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. A colt is a young donkey, male young donkey. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, here's your response. Just say this: the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. All right. So if you've been around any length of time, you know I'm very fond of saying that every word in the scripture is important. And I'll give you an example right here. So you read this text and you're like, okay, what's the big deal? Why include this part in the narrative? Like this part about a donkey and a colt that Jesus would ride them into. Like, what's the big deal with that? How does that help to advance the narrative in any meaningful way? It's actually quite huge. If you think that it's seemingly insignificant, you'd be dead wrong. And here's why. Verse 4, here's the explanation you're about to find out. Verse 4, this took place to fulfill what was spoken by a prophet, specifically a prophet Zechariah. Now, this is why you've heard me say many times before, there is nothing like biblical Christianity because there is nothing like the Bible in all of literature. Nothing comes close. Fact check it. There's a reason why biblical Christianity is still a thing. There's a reason why the Bible has been around for a long time and stood the test of time. One of the primary reasons that I came to faith in Christ as the Spirit of God inspired the text in my own life was to see and lighten my understanding of the specificity of ancient prophecy fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. It blows your mind. You have to be open-minded and open-hearted enough to receive it. So here's what's happening. You get this seemingly insignificant detail about Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. You're like, what's the point? And the author says, here's the point. 1,500 years earlier, God spoke to a prophet named Zechariah. And what he told Zechariah was this. Here's how the people are gonna be able to identify their king, their Messiah. He's gonna ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. Here's what the text says. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, verse 5, say to the daughter of Zion. Daughter of Zion refers to Jerusalem and the Jews. Behold, your king is coming to you. Awesome, how are we gonna know who he is? Like, tell us, give us an indicator. Okay, here's how. He's gonna arrive humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The king of the Jews will arrive on the back of this humble creature. Some of you know that during times of war back in the day, kings rode into town on stallions, preferably white stallions, considered war horses. But in times of peace, kings rode into town on donkeys. Donkeys are interesting characters, right? Kind of stubborn, but also affable. When the creators of Shrek wanted to introduce a lovable character, what did they create? Donkey. Harmless. Jesus comes into town on the back of a donkey. God told the prophet Zechariah 1,500 years earlier, this is gonna be one indicator. This is gonna be one way that you'll notice who your king is. He arrives on a donkey. Okay, so there's more. Verse 6, the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. Verse 7, they brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks and he sat on them. So most likely Jesus rode on the colt itself, which is again the younger male donkey. Wasn't uncommon for an older donkey to be paired with the younger donkey in order to help it understand what it's supposed to do in life. So all of this makes perfect sense. You know, some critics say, well, there's two donkeys in the text, but Jesus only rode on one. Well, yeah, but if you understand anything about how donkeys operate, this is it, right? You take the older, pair it with the younger. It all makes perfect sense in the text, okay? So this is exactly what happens. Now, watch the crowd's response. Most of the crowd, verse 8, spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. So you have to picture this. Very common scene. This isn't new for the first time just because Jesus is riding into town. But again, it's a way of showing respect and honor. And think of this as an ancient red carpet treatment for someone of high value, worth, and esteem coming into the city. Verse 9, and the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting. Now the crowds are beginning to swell around Jesus because again, just a few days earlier in this town of Bethany, outside of Jerusalem, Jesus raises a man from the dead. And people are talking about it. And so the entourage is beginning to grow. He rolls into town. People are following him. They're identifying him like, hey, I was there. I saw this event happen. So back in the day, I mean, Jesus is like the show. He's the show. And most of the people were enamored by Jesus, especially when he started feeding people. In a day when you were wondering where your next meal was gonna come from, if you were in the crowd listening to him and your stomach was growling and he starts feeding everybody miraculously, that's the guy that you wanna hang out with, okay? So his popularity is beginning to ascend. Take note of that because it's gonna pose a threat to the religious leaders. Why did they crucify Jesus? Well, because he claimed to be God. That's blasphemy. But he also posed a threat to the religious leaders. So all of a sudden, as we march through these days, you're gonna see the religious leaders come to this boiling point and they're like, this guy has to die. Good Friday, the crucifixion, okay? This is just the first day. It begins when he enters, arriving as the King of the Jews. What audacity. What a threat. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, no, I'm not who you think I am. He's actually receiving it. Crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Son of David is another prophetic fulfillment because the Messiah would come from the line of Abraham through David. This is why some of the gospel writers, when they begin their account of Jesus, where do they start? With his genealogy. Why is that important? Because everybody knows that the Messiah is Jewish. He's going to be born from Abraham, from the line of David. And so everybody's checking the street cred on that one. What are the credentials? Like, what's his birthright? That's why the gospel writers say, let's tell you, this Jesus, let's just start here. Let's look at his genealogy. You can trace it back through. So he's fulfilling all that as well. That's why he's called the Son of David. That's a royal lineage line. The king would come from the line of David. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So the word Hosanna literally means save us. And here's where the misconception begins. So it is today. Many people do not see Jesus for who he really is, even within the Christian community. It's a Jesus of their own making. Many of the Jews, especially the religious zealots, were like, listen, we can't wait for our Messiah King to arrive because when he comes, he will lead us to victory. He will wield the sword and he will chop up the Romans. And Israel will be restored to her former glory. And he will lead us out from underneath the oppressive Roman rule. The religious zealots were always looking for a fight. So they see Jesus entering and they're like, could it be? Is this our guy? Man, when is the rebellion going to start? Because we're ready to throw down. But they missed it. Jesus is going to lead a rebellion, but it's not going to be done by force or by sword. He's not coming to kill Romans. He's actually coming to allow himself to be killed by the Romans. And in doing so, his death will set forth the revolution, which will not be a revolution of power, but it will be a revolution that takes over the human heart. Very few saw this coming. They would be very disappointed in Jesus. Some of the same crowd that shouts, Hosanna, our guy, will be the same ones shouting what? Kill that guy. Nail him to the cross. Phony. Did not meet our expectations. Verse 10, and when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up. Everybody's like, who is this? So you're talking about several 100,000 people have some awareness. The Romans are stationing guards all throughout the city because they don't want the Jews acting up during their Holy Week. They gave them some liberties. They couldn't carry out their own death penalty, by the way. This is why they had to have Jesus delivered up to the Romans in order to be crucified. But the Romans are monitoring the situation very, very closely. They're keeping an eye on this Jesus. And the crowds said, this is the prophet, Jesus. Well, prophet Jesus. There were other prophets who had come on the scene. Jesus is a very common name. It literally, just think of it as a shortened version of the Hebrew name Joshua, which literally means God saves. So even Jesus' name is in alignment with his purpose. But more specifically, this is the Jesus that is from Nazareth of Galilee. Nazareth. When it's understood that Jesus comes from Nazareth, the people begin to say, wait, Nazareth? In fact, it's asked, can anything good come from Nazareth? So I know I kind of cap on Gila Bend, right? You've all been to Gila Bend. I love Gila Bend. Gila Bend's great, man, But let me just show them some love. Pass by Gila Bend and go straight to Y, Arizona. You ever go to Rocky Point and drive down? What do? You pass through Y, Arizona, okay? Y, Arizona makes Gila Bend, Arizona look like a mega city. The population of Y right now, roughly 125 people. That's Nazareth. We have some ancient historical documents from Roman soldiers that were based there. And basically they say, get us out of this godforsaken backwater place. Nazareth is an armpit. We want out. And so they say, well, it's Jesus. Okay, gee, I know a lot of Jesuses, you know what I'm saying? Well, this is the Jesus from Nazareth. Oh, Nazareth. Oh, there was only one Jesus from Nazareth. Okay, gotcha. Really? That guy? What comes out of Y, Arizona? What comes out of Nazareth? That's why the Old Testament also says that Jesus would come from obscurity. In our own time, you'd think, clearly the Messiah is going to be born and raised in the holy city of Jerusalem, right? No. It would be like New York, LA, Paris, London, right? No. Some small, out-of-the-way place that most of you have never been to or even heard of. Because that's how God does things, by the way. You know, when Jesus is born, he's in the place where animals are kept. Why? Because God is communicating something to you. Humble. Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem. What's the communication? Humble. This is a different kind of king. By the way, Jesus will return, and he's not going to be riding a donkey. First day of Passion Week, Jesus publicly reveals himself as king, receives that worship, fulfills very specific prophecy. Day 2, Monday morning, Jesus performs his only miracle that involves a curse. This one gets interesting. Mark chapter 11, verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, so you see what I'm saying? They're probably staying in Bethany. They go back to Bethany at the end of the day. Now they're coming back to Jerusalem. When they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance picture this, a fig tree in leaf. He went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. For it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. Matthew adds that the fig tree was cursed by Jesus and actually wilted. And you're like, Jesus, lighten up. I mean, you having a bad day? You know what I'm saying? You thinking about the end of the week or what's going on, right? It seems out of pocket. Until you understand fig trees. So, a fig tree produces its fruit just before or at the same time the tree produces its leaves. Kind of interesting plant like that. So, when you see a fig tree with green leaves, you immediately assume it has figs. So this tree is deceptive. This tree should have its fruit. It has all the outward appearances of having produced something good. But in fact, it's fake. It's kind of phony. It's deceptive. In both the Old and New Testaments, the fig tree is used to illustrate the spiritual condition of the nation of Israel. You see, outwardly, the nation looked good, appeared very religious, but spiritually, the nation was completely barren. And Jesus actually curses the tree, which I think is a foreshadow, a little nod to Jesus' interaction that he's about to have as he engages with the religious ruling class of the day. Outwardly looking good, but inwardly they were just rotten to the core. They had green leaves, but they had no figs. Later that day, he encounters these pseudo-spiritual leaders, and he cleans house, literally. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. This is interesting. So the temple had its own currency. And if you wanted to pay your temple taxes, you had to exchange whatever currency you had into the form of temple currency. And of course, if you didn't have what was required exactly, then it could be provided for you at an exchange rate. Or if you brought a lamb and it was deemed to be blemished, therefore unacceptable, oh, but that's okay for you because you can buy an unblemished lamb from us over here. And even there was a stipulation for the poor. Because animals had to be sacrificed, there is no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. And so if you were poor and you couldn't afford a lamb, then for just a couple pennies, you could buy a couple of pigeons. But Jesus sees what's happening. Later, he calls it robbery. So you have these religious people in the temple for no other reason than to make a profit off of those who are just symbolized with this, who want to sincerely worship the God that they serve. And Jesus isn't having it. He addresses it. He says, no, you're charging exorbitant exchange rates. You're stealing from the people. If every lamb is blemished and you're selling unblemished lambs at a higher price, or even for the poor, you're charging too much for those pigeons. You're robbing people. It's a place of corruption. Verse 17. And he was teaching them and saying to them, and now he's going to quote Isaiah 56. Jesus was always quoting the Old Testament, very often Isaiah, because Isaiah gave several prophecies describing the Messiah. So Jesus would quote, and then he'd be like, all of the Old Testament is like a neon sign flashing forward to Jesus. If we're not talking about Jesus as the fulfillment of literally hundreds of prophecies, who are we talking about? So he begins to teach them, and he quotes the prophet. Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, not robbery, and it shall be for all the nations, which is great because this is Jesus saying it's not just a Jewish thing, it's going to be for Gentiles as well, for all the nations. But you have made it a den of robbers. Note taken, verse 18. And the chief priests and the scribes, they represented the religious ruling class of the day. They heard it, and then they were seeking a way to destroy him because they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. The crowd is stunned by what Jesus says. Why? Well, we know that they say nobody ever talks like him. Nobody has ever spoken with such authority. Additionally, he is actually claiming the temple, which everybody knows. Every good God-fearing Jew knows. The temple belongs to God. And Jesus says, yeah, and because I am God and I share the deity of God, this is also my house. This is yet another way Jesus makes his claim to deity. Now, the hostility from the religious ruling elite is about to boil over. Day 3. Tuesday, Jesus begins to teach, debate, and he gives a few prophetic warnings. Mark chapter 11, beginning with verse 20. As they passed by in the morning, the disciples, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God, not in any religious ruling class. Jesus never came to start religion. He came to forge a relationship with the people created in the image of God. Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. All right, let's bring some clarity here. Unlike the Word of Faith movement teachers, this does not mean that we get everything that we ask from God. If only we would believe hard enough and have enough faith. Prayer must always align with God's will. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 14, we read this: if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And we know that if God hears us, he always responds. Now, how does he respond? Sometimes he grants us our request. Yes, you may have the request of your heart. Other times he says, not yet. I'm just going to hold you in a season of wait and trust. And then sometimes he just says, no, that is actually not my will for your life. So no, you're not going to get it. Now, I'll give you an example of this from the life of Paul. In 2 Corinthians, he prays 3 times for a thorn in the flesh to be removed from him. 3 times. When I want things removed in my life that are unwanted, I'm praying like 300 times. You know what I'm saying? Paul 3 times. And then he comes to the realization, God is not taking it away. Therefore, it is his will that this burden remains in my life. And then he says, and here's why. To keep me humble and to keep me dependent upon him. God is always interested in what he's doing to you, because when he transforms your heart, that's what he's doing to you, then what happens through you is more than what you could ever ask or think. But this may be a season that God is saying, this is what I'm doing to you. I'm going to keep you in this space that's a bit uncomfortable, dependent upon me. So, no. Faith is trusting in God, not manipulating him. It's Jesus in the garden. Not my will be done, but yours. Jesus says, God, this is my will. Let this cup pass from me. But quick to add, not my will, but yours be done. And of course, the will of God was to use the greatest tragedy to bring about the greatest good, because that's what God does. So next, Jesus is confronted over his teachings and actions. Verse 27, and they came again to Jerusalem. They spend the night nearby in Bethany. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. Now, they don't like him. And they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Because see, for them, it was all about authority. It was all about hierarchy. Who gave you this authority to do them? Okay, this is to show that the religious leaders are really pressing in on him and they want him dead. Jesus then, in response, launches into a few parables that kind of poke the bear a little bit more about the coming kingdom and his return. And he drops this in Mark chapter 13, beginning with verse 32. But concerning that day, the day that I come back, that I return, concerning that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son. He says, myself, I don't know, but only the Father, he knows. So here's the thing. Knowing not the date or the hour, the specific time, here's what I want you to know. Be on the alert. Be on guard. Keep awake. For you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, that's us, we're the servants. God has entrusted us with our work to do. We just want to be faithful with it. And he commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. The doorkeeper was the person who would let individuals in and out. Stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come. In the evening, could come at midnight, when the rooster crows early in the morning, lest he come suddenly and he finds you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to everyone, stay awake. So the emphasis from Jesus to his followers about his return is simply this: I'm coming back. Don't get too distracted by the exact time and day. Rather, just be ready. Just live your lives in such a way so that when I return, you're like, oh, great. I mean, imagine if Jesus said, on this day, at this time, at this hour, I'm coming back. You know what would happen? A bunch of Christians would just be goofing around until the last minute. You know what I'm saying? They'd be like, well, we got an hour left, everybody. Look busy. So let me just say this too. Every generation has had its Christians who have said, Jesus is coming back in our generation. Every generation has had Christians who say, this is it. Jesus is coming back. Look at the signs. Look at the times. Can't you see that Jesus is coming back? This has made some authors throughout history very rich. You know what I'm saying? Now, one generation is going to be right. You know what I'm saying? One generation is going to be right. It's been 2,000 years. I think even the earliest followers of Jesus anticipated his return soon. Again, here we are 2,000 years later. And so what happens is people get wrapped around the axle on the specific day, date, and time, and they want to figure that out. That's fine. End times, that's cool stuff. That's great to talk about. Yeah. If anything, it should lead you to holy living here and now. The emphasis is this: just be ready. In 1 John, there's a really interesting, fascinating verse, sobering. It says, we don't want to shrink back away from him in shame when he appears. Isn't that interesting? It's like all of a sudden Jesus returns. It's like, oh wait, can you give me an hour to sort some things out in my life to get more right with you? Then come back. That's an interesting verse, yeah? Jesus says, yeah, be ready, be ready. No one knows exactly. So live daily in light of my return. So on day 3, Jesus proclaims his return and the emphasis on being ready. Day 4, Wednesday. It seems to be a day of rest for Jesus. However, behind the scenes, something sinister is lurking. This is the calm before the storm. This is the moment that marks a major turning point because Judas is plotting to betray Jesus. He has this secret meeting. Some traditions call this Spy Wednesday. Matthew 26. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, which, by the way, according to the Old Testament, was the price of a common slave. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. That would happen the next day, day 4. Jesus celebrates the Passover. And he does that on a Thursday. You say Thursday, should be Friday. Traditionally, the Jews from the region of Galilee celebrated Passover on Thursday. He institutes this new covenant. This is absolutely revolutionary. This would have been one of the most amazing moments to be a fly on the wall in the life of Jesus, because he's taking all of the traditional elements of the Passover and he's flipping the script, and he applies those things to himself. The bread, for example, was known as the bread of affliction, and it had everything to do with the nation of Israel and their wanderings through the desert, and God fed them with bread from heaven. It was during this time of affliction, and it was meant to represent the affliction of the people. And Jesus says, nah, the bread doesn't represent the affliction of the people. He says, this bread is my body. I'm the one that's going to be afflicted, but for you. This cup, this is why Jesus says, this cup represents a new covenant. Isn't that interesting? Old Testament, probably better referred to as Old Covenant. There's something new coming. The Old Covenant, Old Testament, had animals being sacrificed for the sins of the people. The wages of sin is death. That's how serious God takes it. Animals were sacrificed. The life of a creature is in its blood. They had to shed the blood. Jesus says something new. New covenant. The wine in this cup is now my blood. Because Jesus was sinless, his death, his shed blood was once for all. So the disciples are hearing all of these things for the first time in the context of Jesus being the fulfillment of all of these Passover things, and they're just they're contemplating it. They're thinking about it. And as they're doing this, as they appropriate these words, Jesus then gets up and takes off his outer garment and gets the water, and he starts washing their feet. And this is the man who's about to be nailed to a cross, and he has this kind of awareness. Jesus is the ultimate leader. He's the ultimate example. And then he says, I'm doing this to leave you as an example. Christians, treat one another like this. Wash each other's feet. What is the message? Again, humility, service. If you've ever had your feet washed by another brother or sister, it will bring you to tears. There's almost a sense where you're like, just don't do that. It's almost uncomfortable because it is such a low, humble place for someone to be at your feet, especially back in the day. It was a job reserved for a slave. And Jesus says, that's you, Christian. You are a slave to each other. Why? Because the world will know that you are my followers by the love you have for one another. So serve one another. And by the way, I'm not just telling you this, I'm actually showing you. As all of this is happening, this angry mob begins to gather. The full weight of what Jesus is about to endure falls on him. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prays, his sweat become as drops of blood, and he pours his heart out. The mob approaches. Judas comes near. Master, what you do quickly. This also reveals God's sovereignty. Even though Judas chose to betray Jesus, God was still in total control. Yet another fulfilled prophecy. When Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, it was not just symbolic of the price of a slave, but it was also according to what was spoken before. Again, Zechariah. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. The text goes on to say that after Judas betrayed Jesus, he felt deep remorse, so much so that he took the 30 pieces of silver and gave it to the temple. But those in charge of the money at the temple decided that they would buy a piece of land with the 30 pieces of silver. And the land happened to belong to a potter. Thursday sets the stage for what would happen on Good Friday. So, let me wrap it up by saying this. Here's a few thoughts for you based on these days. Day 1, Sunday, his triumphal entry. What is Jesus saying? He's saying, I'm the true king. Who is your king? Who is your king? Do you receive him as such? Monday, Jesus cleanses the temple, showing his deity. This is my house. Therefore, Jesus should have lordship over our own lives. Tuesday, Jesus curses the fig tree for its hypocrisy. It's outwardly look good, but inwardly, Jesus saw right through it. Therefore, you and I should examine the fruit in our own lives. Wednesday, Judas prepares his betrayal. Question for you and I, am I choosing something? Maybe it's just like Judas, money. Or some relationship or some other thing over Jesus. Thursday, the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane prayer. I think above all things that happened on this particular day, for me, what stands out is that Jesus would submit to the will of God so that you and I could be blessed. Therefore, what would we possibly withhold from him? So, Father, what a series of events that reveal who Jesus is and what he came to do. Father, I'm grateful for the plan that brought Jesus to the cross. I'm grateful for the scriptures and their uniqueness. Christianity is not a blind faith. It is a faith that is well-reasoned, and you've given us a mountain of evidence to believe that your word is true, it is factual, that Jesus is who he said he was, that he was sent to this planet to save us from ourselves. So as we enter into this week, Lord, I pray that you would prepare our minds and hearts for all that this week means. Lord, for those who are in the room who may not know you, I pray that your spirit would continue to nudge. I pray that their hearts and minds would be enlightened to your truth. And Lord, with great anticipation, we look forward to celebrating the greatest event in all of human history, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is no one more worthy of our praise and adoration. Jesus, we declare to you now, you are the true King. All for your glory, we pray. And God's people said, amen.